Bula everyone. Nakra sema mai. Yes, Bula Vinaka everyone. Those of you logging in from Kadavu, Bula Vinaka. Bula Vinaka, everyone from Kadavu listening in, Bula Vinaka. Vinaka vakalevu for joining in today, and that's a beautiful song called Liwaviau and sung by the Vangan Rokan Isangani group from Vanuatu. Vinaka vakalevu for joining in today, and thank you so much for adhering to our humble request for all of you to join in tonight. This month has been a very special month for the province of Kadavu. So if you are from Kadavu, you must make some noise through Facebook and just do a wave or a shaka as they do here in Hawaii, or say bula on the chat and say which part of Kadavu you're from. So tonight is your night, and this month is our month. So it's very, very special for the province of Kadavu that we've been inviting different speakers to come on my platform and just share, different interesting topics of Kadavu. We started off with Tale Tora from the village of Nangaloto in the province of Yahweh, and then we had Manasa Tuidakau from the village of Nasengai in the district of Ravitaki. And also on Friday, we had Alice in the Urewa. And on Saturday, we were serenaded by a special band called Pacific Breeze, all the way from Manitoba in Canada, from two brothers from the village of Tiliva, the district of Nakaseleka, Isimasi and Manomasi. Nimbula Vinaka, au saravos ngani Kadavu, and ka Vinaka ni kua wambulu chuka ni vike mnikeve and no ni ava chukume ni kua una vos chuka kina babalangi ni sa ava mai nando bulangi o Professor Patrick Nunn vavi ni Vinaka sar kina vakalevu vike mnina no ni ava mai na ka talanga ni kua e a ro talanga nando bulangi o rendini kasni buli vadengu talanga koya o litiana krokowati vakasilimi sia masar chukwa mai wani mbuka o koe marama ni wailevu na tikino rabitaki mai Kadavu talanga en ronga na ya ua sige o tingoro sia matar chunga me rona viutini ro sia masar chukwa me natumua o enosi vatiki emi na kla ken rovarong chuku mena tumua ke muruka na biotini vambul sar chuka tubi ke muruka badingani mai ava koso na Veitalanoa au ni tekina ni dorna dotanga isota talembe kan stiga boruai en na tolu na kalok ke bakara ni murunga lala mai na tumua mendo mai sota talemanda na Veitalanoa ni cheche kena chili chuku na rawe o sibena kena te chuku na angona. Ia Vinaka valeu sara na nomuniado mai vakalevu ni bula Vinaka na sema tiku mai Australia ni Silandi mai Kenya Vinaka valeu ndo bula mai Ngilandi mai Amerika Canada vakatalanga kina mai ni Silandi lalai mai Kadavu vikimni na sema tiku mai yavutu mumbula Vinaka iyo na kavini kua umara usara ni saya mai na nonto bulangi Professor Patrick Nunn. Au klani bunga vi kemunio ni sa kileikoya au ni sa ronga talanga na dana sando wete talanga ko na lebu na program mai viti mai sema talchunga ko na Veitalanoa membaleti moturiki na YASANA o lo mai viti. Ia o Professor Patrick Nunn ko na professor ni geography na University of the Sunshine Coast mai Australia. O klani no gai kerei koe mena gai wakamadal teki koe manta wakalele weekenda ia na kanga lele ngau sakila koe turanga ni Ngilandi sa mai intende sartuna nona mai tue viti o klani dini sa chukum Australia o koe kila chunga koe ni koe turanga ni viti ia ngono koe mena sa wambul sarani be Professor Patrick Nunn bula Vinaka Professor
bula
Patrick
Vinaka Dr. T bula Vinaka kede mai New Zealandi lalai.
Vinaka valeu. Thank you so much for accepting a humble request to be back for the province of Kadavu. And I know you have done a lot of work in Kadavu, but maybe for those who have just maybe met you for the very first time, if it's okay, just for you to tell us where you're logging in from and what do you do for a living? Maybe in addition to what I've just said earlier. Vinaka Paddy.
Nakavalevu tarisi. Ni wasota sarau wasava palangi. Au wasava viti vakoro I'll send wasava viti vakandondono. Ni wasota sara. I'm calling in from the Sunshine Coast in Australia. Baravini Singa, my Australia, and it's a very interesting place, but it's not Fiji, and it's not the Pacific, and I wish I was living in the Pacific, and but I'm not at the moment. So I teach geography at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and but I spent 25 years at the University of the South Pacific in its Suva campus, and I know that many of my former students wrote to me after the last Facebook Live event, Talanoa with Dr. T, and it was so good to hear from you all, and I really appreciate that, and it's so good to be in touch once again.
Vinaka valeu. There's so many of your past students as well, as you mentioned. There's many of them who still remember you in the lecture halls at USP. So many of them still remember you so well, and they still remember some of the classes that you taught us. And many of us still remember some of your lectures. So it's such a blessing to have you back on my program and for you to share. And even more special for me, I'll be biased for you to talk about my island. So I'm really, really stoked and very happy.
Vinaka, Vinaka.
Vinaka. Isa. Vinaka vale besar pedi na nomu sulema na nomu ngonai me daru me Veitalanoa vatal na signifua. And as you were mentioning in our last conversation, you highlighted to me that a few years ago you did some research and some work on Kadavu. So maybe just tell us a little bit on why Kadavu and when was the first time you visited the island?
Ooh, I think I must have been to Kadavu about 5 times. I was thinking about this. And the first time I went on a USP boat to Dravuni, and I didn't go around much of Kadavu. But the second time I took the ulunivanua, the ferry that sank near Rotuma. I took the ulunivanua and we went all the way around, but I ended up in Davingele in Nambukilevu. And I always remember that trip because I spoke a little bit of Fijian at the time, and all the people from the Mbulunideva, the crew, they said, come, 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 we drink grog. So all the way from Suva to Kadavu, everyone else was sleeping, but I was downstairs with the crew and we were drinking grog and telling stories. And I always remember that as my first proper trip to Kadavu. So I've spent a lot of time in Nambukilevu, but also sort of Vunisea, Tavuki, Ravitaki. I never got to Matanuku, but I went along the south coast there. And I've also, in the last, I suppose, 5 or 6 years, done some research in Ono and Nakasaleka side, around Kavala Bay and places like that. And when I say I've done some research, I mean, I'm interested in geology, but I'm also interested in the ancient human history of Kadavu. So when did the first people come to Kadavu? Where did they stay? What did they do? And what have they left behind that we can see today? So I'm interested in all these kinds of research questions.
Wow. Yes, and when you were visiting Kadavu at that time, you were representing USP, and that was part of your role that you were playing when you were in the geography department.
That's right. That's right. So everyone who teaches at USP, you do some teaching and you do some research as well. And I think one of the problems that I had when I first came to USP was that everyone was learning about other places, but not their own places. Eh? And so I felt it really important for me to educate myself about the Pacific. And I've always been interested in volcanoes, and Kadavu is a line of volcanoes. I'm going the wrong way across the screen. A line of volcanoes like that. The oldest volcano is in the northeast at Solo, where the lighthouse is, and then Dravuni and Vanuakula. These islands, they were volcanoes, active volcanoes, more than 3 million years ago. And then you come down through Bulia, Ono, into Nakasaleka, and across the central part of Kadavu. And you've got volcanoes there that are 2.5 million years, 2 million years. And then finally you come to Nambukilevu, which is the youngest volcano in the Kadavu group. So you go from Solo, which is about 3.5 million years old, to Nakasaleka. To Nambukilevu, which is, I'll talk about it later, but a bit more recent.
So
So you
maybe
can see that.
this map might be better, this one here.
Yeah, Dr. Teresi has put up a really nice map there. So up in the northeast, that's the top right for people who aren't geographers. Vanokula, Dravuni, these are the remains of volcanoes. Most of them are underwater now that formed about 3.5 million years ago. And then you come down through Bulia, through Ono, and into eastern Kadavu, Nakasaleka. And these volcanoes are about 2.9, 2.5 million years old. When you get to Naikorokoro, there's a volcano. The volcano there was about 2.4 million years old. And then you move down to Nambucalevu, or Mount Washington, as it used to be called. And Nambucalevu is a very young volcano. And in fact, the first time I went to Kadavu proper, it was because there had been newspaper reports in the Fiji Times about the kurukuru, the sounds of thunder, not thunder, the rumbling coming from inside the volcano. And people in Taulalia and Davengele and the other villages around Nambucalevu had said that they'd heard this kurukuru, the rumbling sound coming from inside the volcano. And they really wanted a geologist to go down there and see what was happening. So yes, I went there, and this was the trip on the Ulunivanua. And I remember that we went to Vunisea, and then we walked from Vunisea to Tavuki, to Yahweh,
Yes.
then to Taulalia, and Richmond, of course, on the way. We stayed the night in Richmond, and then we crossed from Taulalia to Davengele. And I was very friendly with Ratuada Songo Songo, the late Ratuada Songo Songo. So we stayed in his house, and he was tui Nambucalevu at the time, and so he was a very good person for a foreigner like me to be friendly with, because he opened a lot of doors for me, and was a thoroughly nice man. I liked him a lot. And so I stayed in Davengele for maybe 10 days or something like that. And we went down to Nambucalevu Ira. And of course, I tried climbing Nambucalevu several times, because I wanted to see the rocks that it was made from. The big problem with a lot of Kadavu is that there are no paths. There's no paths up the mountains.
So you have to create your own, in a way?
You have to create your own, hey? And yeah, so it was very difficult, I remember, at the time. And it was very hard to find any real rocks on Nambucalevu, because Alevuna Veikau, there was lots of forest. Susunangele, the soil was very thick and very wet. And I just remember every day trying to climb up Nambucalevu, and just sort of coming back just covered in mud from head to toe, and wet, and disappointed. But could I just tell you the story, Tarisi, that changed a lot of what I thought about Kadavu? So I think I like to drink Yangona. And I think that in all of Fiji, I think the Wainivanua, the water that you mix the grog with in Nambucalevu, is probably the best I have ever tasted.
Wow.
No, I'm not saying it because it's you.
No, I fully guarantee. I'm so glad you're saying it, because it supports what I always say. So to all my friends, hear what Professor Paddy just talked about. Vinaka.
Because you've got a high mountain, and it gets a lot of rainfall, so the water goes through, it gets filtered. When it comes out at the bottom, around villages like Davengele, it tastes really nice. And I never got sick there. I drank grog every night. And but that's the thing, Tarisi. When you sit and you drink grog, and you listen to the stories that people are telling, that's when you learn a lot of information. And everyone in Fiji knows that, except for the dumb foreigners like me, who come and they think, well, it's just people telling stories. Just and one of the stories that I heard first in Davengele was the story of Tautau Malau and Tanovu. Tanovu. Tautau Malau was the vu, or the god, if you like, of Nambucalevu, and Tanovu was the god or the vu of Ono. And you can see from Tarisi's map that Ono is on one side of Kadavu and Nambucalevu is on the other side. And the story is that Tanovu on Ono, every afternoon, what he liked to do was to go down to the beach on Ono and sit and look at the sun sinking over the western horizon. And one day he went down there, he did that, and he saw this monstrous mountain had been built and it blocked his view of the sunset. So Tanovu got very angry and he flew across to Nambucalevu and he started to dig the mountains. He started to knock it down. And this, of course, was Nambucalevu, the volcano. And Tautau Malau got very angry with this and started to confront Tanovu. And so they fought each other in the sky above above Nambucalevu. And then they fought each other, and eventually Tautau Malau pursued or chased Tanovu all the way along the Kadavu Islands, past Ono, past Dravuni, all the way up to the edge of the coral reef, the great astrolabe reef, na Vakalevu. And then they turned around and came back, and then the fight was over. And this was a story that I first heard in Davengele, in Nambucalevu, probably about 25 years ago. And of course, Kaliapate Tavola has written a lot about this particular story. If you haven't looked at Kaliapate Tavola's website, kaindravuni.org, I think it is, maybe .com. But if you just Google Kaindravuni, then you can find out more about this particular story. But it's a very interesting story that suggests that people on Ono had memories of the volcanic eruption of Nambucalevu, because they were saying, before we used to see the sun setting in the west, and after this happened, a big mountain was built there. And I'll talk more about this story perhaps a little bit later in the program. Up to you, Dr. T.
Sandin, Vinaka Sarangai, because I know Kaliopati Tavola have also extended an invitation to him and Emma Tavola, his daughter, Merola Kumai, for them to share that particular story too, because they've written the book, children's book, in the local dialect as well. So I just want to acknowledge Kaliopati Tavol, Vinaka, Professor Paddy, for mentioning his name. And it's really a very good point you mentioned in terms of storytelling. Dona kambimbi sarangaya, because it's okay for us to take this story seriously. Ele mo nangaw nenda do tukon. Ngona talo makawa sa nonrana ngona makawa si oira nangasi na si talo non inta kuni kuila. But I think Professor Paddy, these stories you were talking about, the ones you heard in Davengele, has some leanings towards the geology project or studies that you were doing. So you can carry on now and make the connection on that part.
Okay. So before I went to Kadavu and before I'd heard this story, we thought that the most recent eruption of Nambucalevu volcano was probably about 50,000 years ago. So the first people in Fiji arrived about 3,000 years ago. So we thought that the eruption was long, long before that, about 50,000 years ago. But when I heard that story, it made me think, the story sounded to me like a memory of a volcanic eruption, which means that the geologists and the science was wrong, and that the Talanoa Makawa, the old stories, were correct. And I think that's a really, really good example of exactly what you're talking about. Sometimes we dismiss old stories like this because we think they're just old people talking, but very often they have meaning, not just in Kadavu, not just in Fiji, but in many, many other parts of the world. We're slowly realizing that these stories are often based on people's observations of things that science doesn't necessarily know very much about. So I think that's a really good example of exactly that kind of thing. And of course, the story was proved correct a few years later when they took the road from Davengele and took it all the way to Nambucalevu. And when they did that, they had to cut through some of the rocks from Nambucalevu volcano. And they found one place where there was a soil with pottery in. So Dunangele, Vatakelevu Koroniviti Makawa I Loma. Lots of pottery inside it. And then above that, there was volcanic ash that had come out of the volcano. So we were able to say people were there. This was the soil they were growing crops in. This is some of the pottery that they were making. And then there had been a volcanic eruption over the top. And so we knew then that the story was correct and that the geologists who'd come before, including me, were wrong. So it's a really good example of the kind of thing that you're talking about, the value of ancient stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's something, huge encouragement for those of you who are listening in. As Professor Paddy was saying, Kaliopati Tavola and Emma Tavola, as a father and daughter project, they're starting to write these books, children's books. So they decided to go back down to the children to start telling the stories back to the younger generation and then start to move up to the next generation. So I'm really glad that they have decided to write it in book form. So in this case, Professor Paddy was hearing the Talanoa heard in the village of Ndavingele, but in the case of Nravuni, for the Tavola family, they're starting to write about it. So maybe if I can add on to what you're saying, for those of you who are listening in, just encouraging your everyone who are from Fiji, start writing your own stories. Writing, even for those of you who are teachers or parents, start publishing your own books, writing it in your own dialects, writing it in the Fijian language, and in addition to what the Ministry of Education is going to be providing through the ministry. So I just thought I mentioned it as what the Tavola father and daughter project, which I'm really, really proud of, that Kaliopat and Emma has done for this particular story that you're talking about. So Vinaka vakalevu, Professor Paddy, for highlighting this story and connecting it to the volcano. So let's go back to Nambucalevu.
Let me just say one more thing on the story, please,
Sure.
Tarisi. And that is that Kaliopate Tavola, of course, his mother comes from Ono, from Nambuwalu. So he knows the story on Ono very well. When I was staying on Ono, I sat down with Ratu Petoro Uluinadeva from Nawaisomo Koro on Ono. And he told me his version of the story. And I sat down with his wife, Vara, who comes from Bulia, and she was telling me another version of the story. And then I also have talked a lot to Kaliopate Tavola. And I've had a student, not a Fijian student, but a French student, working on Kadavu. And we've been going from one koro to another, getting different versions of the Nambucalevu story. So we've got a version from Ravitaki, from Taniela Mbolea, who is my neighbor here. And we also collected a version from Nambucalevu Ira, from a gentleman who was 93 years old, Ratu Eveli Yalanambai. And Ratu Eveli told us this really good version of the Nambucalevu story. But it was interesting because his version was from the Nambucalevu side, whereas Petro and Vara, their version was from the Ono and Bulia side. Kaliapate, I think, takes a more balanced view and recognizes there's different versions of the story. But we're all working together, and we're hoping to get an article published in a journal that comes out of Harvard University. We're very close at the moment. So we're also working with Melina Nuku from the Fiji Museum and Paulo Gerati from the University of the South Pacific, and a couple of other people as well. So it's very interesting. My student is interested in how a story evolves depending on where it's told. So where close to Nambucalevu, people will often privilege Tatamalao, and people on Ono will often privilege Tanovu in the stories. And so it's very interesting to look at that balance. So that's all I need to say about that story.
Vinaka, because I think Talanoa has some connections to place, and also you mentioned Polongereti's name. He has been telling us on my program Nambimbi in the place names. Nunn. So for many of us Fijians, so it's very important for you to know Nayadani no Mukoro, Nayadani no Muyavusa, Nayadani no Matangali, Nayadani no Mutokotoka. They all have meanings and they all have stories. So it all comes back to what you're saying, Professor Paddy, that oral history, geography, geology, paleontology, volcanology, all have connections. And if we are alert to see the connections, it's going to open up a lot of rich heritage stories for our children and our future generations.
Gina Sanga.
Yes, Vinaka. I think there's a lot of Nambucalevu gang listening in. So let's go back to your story about when they were cutting the road. From Nambucalevu. So when you were saying about the rocks, what did they actually see? What kind of rocks did they see?
So a volcano like Nambucalevu, when it erupts, it can produce three types of things. It can produce lava, which is the liquid rock that makes solid rock. It can produce things called pyroclastics, which are basically lumps of solid rock that are thrown out of the volcano. Or it can produce ash, which is very, very fine particles, like the ash from a cooking fire.
Right.
And what they found in that road cutting on the way to Nambucalevu Ira was an old soil that was covered with volcanic ash. So it demonstrated that there had been an eruption of this volcano within the time that people had been living in Nambucalevu. And it's very interesting because we've done more scientific research now on Nambucalevu. And we know that in the 3,000 years that people have lived in Fiji, it has erupted 3 times. So the big eruption, which is what we think people remember in the story of Tataumolao and Tanovu, the big eruption was about 2,500 years ago. Yes. So the first people came to Fiji about 3,000 years ago. And the eruption of Nambucalevu, the big one that formed the mountain, formed the top of the mountain there was about 2,500 years ago. And then there were smaller eruptions about AD 350 and AD 1650. So we have this information now. So Nambucalevu is still an active volcano. The chances are that it's not going to erupt in a big way anytime within the next 1,000 years. But it's still an active volcano, and probably the only active volcano in Kadavu. Although there is a question mark over Ngaloa, Ngaloa Island. So we don't know when Ngaloa formed exactly, but it looks a little bit like Nambucalevu. And it is possible that Ngaloa is quite a young volcano as well. But we don't know that for sure.
Man, that's amazing. I'm so glad you mentioned about those the years. Earlier you mentioned, the 50,000 years, and then, long before the 3,000, we're looking at science and looking at human habitation and the stories of the one you've just mentioned. But now it's within people's memories. So there are stories, there are people remembering things, hearing the sound, the rumbling, and now with the cutting of the road, they've seen the soil and those fine dust
Ash.
maybe that were accumulated, the ash.
Yep.
And then you also mentioned pottery. So, wow. So can you just add a little bit to the pottery story, Paddy Kerau?
Of course. We think that the first people in Fiji arrived in Nandronga. That's what the science is pointing to at the moment, that just near Natandola, at a place called Borewa, and nearby Gongo Island. These are the two earliest human settlements that we know about anywhere in Fiji. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that these are the first settlements, but based on the scientific evidence, these are at the moment the first settlements. But, someone might go out, in the next 6 months and they might find something older somewhere else. So at the moment, that's what the science points to. Kadavu is a big question mark when it comes to early human history. Almost certainly, if people were staying in Nandronga, they would have known about Kadavu. You can probably see Nambucalevu on a clear day from some of the hills in Nandronga. So almost certainly they knew Kadavu was there. Almost certainly they went to Kadavu, but nobody knows exactly where. There have been some archaeologists who've looked there. My feeling is that it would be Taulalia Bay where the first people went, because you've got a nice coastal strip there from Taulalia up to Yahweh, and you've got a nice sheltered bay with lots of food, and there's fresh water as well. So I think probably Taulalia Bay was the first place that people stayed in Kadavu, but there's no evidence for that. But we know that people were staying all over Kadavu, before Europeans arrived in Fiji. And one of the things that I'm very interested in as a research project are the Koronivalu, the old hill forts of Fiji. And it seems that up until about 700 years ago, up until about AD 1400, people were staying along the coastline in Fiji. And then about 600, 700 years ago, they all moved up the mountains. They all moved up to the tops of the mountains and fortified caves, and they fortified hilltops. So it was a change from a time of peace to a time of conflict. That's why they moved up there. And they built Koronivalu. They built walled fortresses on the tops of mountains. And as you know, I've studied these in Singatoka and in Bar and in Bua. And in 2019, we turned our attention, we being me and the Fiji Museum, we turned our attention to Kadavu. And there are lots of stories of Koronivalu almost everywhere in Kadavu. Because you know Kadavu, it's an island like that. You go from the coast and you go up very, very quickly, and you get to these peaky mountains. They're very good places to build walls and to defend yourself against attackers. Dan Bolair was telling me about the hill fort that lies inland from Ravitaki, up there in the mountains there. And I know that the Fiji Museum has been doing quite a lot of research in Nakasaleka. But we concentrated in 2019 on Ono. Ono is the remains of an old volcano. It's an almost perfect volcano. It's not active anymore, but it's like this, and then it's cut on many sides by rivers. And it's a beautifully preserved volcano. But when you get up to the top of the Ono volcano, there's a crater, like a big saucer at the top. And all around the edge of this crater, you find remains of hill forts, of Koronivalu. We only had time to do a little work in Ono, but there's one mountain there called Gilai Tangane, and we got some radiocarbon ages for the hill fort there that go back to about AD 1350. So that's about 700 years ago. We know that people were living on Gilai Tangane about 700 years ago. We were staying in Vambea and Waisomo, and just up the hill behind Vambea and Waisomo is the hill fort of Korovo. And we climbed up to Korovo a couple of times, and we got some radiocarbon ages of about AD 1450 for Korovo, so about 600 years ago, which actually makes sense because the name Korovo implies it's a new hill fort rather than one of the older ones. So Gilai was about 100 years earlier, and so on and so on. So I would like to go back to Ono and do some more research on its Koronivalu, its hill forts. And also I have to say, Tarisi, that if the best Yangona in Kadavu is from Vakalevu, the second best is from Ono. Yes, it was a beautiful place to drink grog and to and to live. But that was before the Langilamba. That was before the tropical cyclone came through. So.
Wow. So there you go. For those of you who are listening in, yeah, really interesting stories. We've been listening to Professor Paddy for his work on the island of Kadavu, particularly going over to Vakalevu and to Ono. And as Professor Paddy keeps saying, in terms of the Angona, Kadavu's Vakalevu seems to be number one at the moment. Ono is number 2. So let's stick to the 2 and please no fighting. Punandona Vivala. But it's just so wonderful to look at the islands, and even for us coming from Kadavu now, most of us will recall or remember, the shapes of the islands and the ulunivanua and where the rivers are will be more attuned, I think, after this talk. So that's something I want to encourage our May Kadavu, is to just to recall or connect to some of your memories of your village, looking at some of the hills and the mountains nearby, and some of the geology, around where you come from. So I know you've been talking about the Cornivalo. I'm gonna quickly jump back to a volcano story, question, sorry. For those of our friends listening in, I know when it comes to volcano, there's always, you mentioned that the Nambucalevu volcano is still active. There's also a word called dormant. Would you be able to just to explain a little bit about, volcanoes that are kind of sleeping or semi-active, or, all those kind of geological elements to it, just for our listeners?
This is something that you learn in a textbook, that a volcano can be active or dormant, which means sleeping, or extinct, which means dead. And I think that there have been many, many examples showing that this is not a very helpful classification. I always remember, it would have been about 20 years ago, when Mount St. Helens in the United States erupted. And everyone there was shocked, the geologists, because they said, this volcano has not erupted for 10,000 years. We thought it was extinct. And then all of a sudden it springs to life again. So I think if I was pushed, I would say that Nambucalevu is probably dormant. It's probably sleeping. That doesn't mean that it's going to wake up again. Of course not. But I think you can probably safely say that volcanoes like the ones represented by Ono, Bulia, Yakuve, even Dravuni, these are extinct. They are not going to suddenly erupt again. And it's very interesting, because if you look at the whole of the, if this is Kadavu, I'll put it your way around, but if this is Kadavu with Dravuni up there and Nambucalevu down here, what has happened over time is that the Earth's crust has closed in this direction. So 3 million years ago, all the activity was here, and then it's closed and it's closed and it's closed, and now the activity is down there. So the chances of anything happening up here are very, very, very small indeed. All the activity for the last 50,000 years has probably been in Nambucalevu. And of course, you get lots of springs there. I think there are also Waikatakata, hot springs there as well. Hot springs,
yes.
There as well. Sometimes I was told by people in Nambucalevu Ira that sometimes the water, the seawater off Nambucalevu Ira, it bubbles like this. And we think that the kuru that people heard, we think that's water being moved around inside the volcano. So we don't think it's liquid rock. This is a beautiful photograph of Nambucalevu from the northeast. We think that this is the kuru comes from water moving around inside the volcano. It's a bit like when you're hungry and you haven't eaten for a while and your stomach starts to gurgle, it starts to make a noise. It's the same kind of thing. It's liquid moving around inside the volcano, but it's not liquid rock. So the kuru might sound very threatening, but it's almost certainly not a sign of an impending eruption.
Right. Wow. And I remembered, I think recently, Paddy, I think 2019, there was a little bit of a shake at Mount, at Ulunivanua. I think I've got some pictures here. This was the latest picture that was shown. I think it was a 5.3 magnitude. There was an earthquake, and there was some shaking around this places. So now you can see the peak of Mount Washington here, Paddy. So you've got Davingele, Angalira, Nambucalevu, and you're mentioning Talolia on this side, and Lomati. So definitely there's such a very, very sharp, these peaks on this side. And I also remembered, if I can recall, in the 90s, I remember going over to Kadavu for a school holiday. I wasn't sure whether it happened when I returned back to Suva. They mentioned that there was an earthquake that actually came all the way to Yahweh, up to my village, because I'm from Natokalau, next to Richmond. And they felt the earthquake there, and they think there was some experience of some cracks near Mount Washington, and there were, I think, white, might be some sulfur, I'm sure, some gas that come through the cracks. So that was interesting as well. Would you like to add something to that, Paddy?
Yeah. So the map that you've got up there on the screen, Nambucalevu is of course Mount Washington, and the village they've got there is Nambucalevu Ira. It's not Nambucalevu. Earthquakes occur in Kadavu not usually underneath the island itself. Usually it's to the south of the island. But of course they affect the island, because when the earthquake happens, then it affects the sea floor, and that shakes the island, and it can cause landslides and things like that. It can cause things to crack. There's a really good example, in fact, from Nambucalevu Ira Koro, from the village there. If you look at the map you've got on the screen, Nambucalevu today is up on a ridge, not a ridge, it's like a platform, about 5 meters above the sea. But if you look just south, just underneath Nambucalevu, you can see an area of cleared ground, the brown area.
Yes.
That's the old Nambucalevu Ira village. And in 1959, there was a tsunami caused by an earthquake, a loka. That's the name for tsunami, you know it. And that tsunami swept across all of Nambucalevu Ira. Fortunately, almost all the people of Nambucalevu Ira had gone to a wedding in Veitalanoa. So there were only 2 or 3 people who were killed when the tsunami came across there. But that's why they moved to Nambucalevu Ira village, because it was very low before, as you can see from the brown area there. They moved it up the hill, which was a very sensible thing to do. So when there is an earthquake, there's often a tsunami, and it's usually the south coast of Kadavu that experiences more earthquakes and perhaps more tsunamis.
Wow.
Can I also say about my late friend Ratu Ada Songo Songo? He told me many times, he said, "You British, you made a mistake when you spelt the name of our koro. It's not Davingele, it's Davengele." And he said Dave is the Nambucalevu word for a grog bowl, a sort of something like this. And he said that's the name, the origin of the name Davengele. And I remember he used to poke me, and he used to say, "You people, you've done so much damage to the names of the places in Fiji." I said, "Yeah." I said, I confess. The Tarinambilo. Yeah, true. So he always says it should be Davengele.
Oh, because Nantave is the clay. It's also the clay.
That's what he told me. That's what he told me. Tanisi. My memory may be at fault, but he said anyway, it's not Davengele.
Yes. Wow. Don't believe Vinaka mean Davingele. And I also know that Ngona from Davingele is also one of the best. Maybe it's number 1 for Nambucalevu Ira, number 2 Davingele. Maybe we move on to number 3. Vinaka to everybody listening in. Such a wonderful Talanoa today. Welcome to the Songo family, who are listening in today. Vinaka vakalevu, Professor Paddy, for mentioning Ratu Avasongo and for those families that looked after you. Yes, I think some of the families are saying bula to you and us on this chat. So it's just nice to hear those names that, especially those that you met, when you were there. And also I have a question too. I remember Professor Paddy, I think I mentioned it in our last Talanoa. There was this gentleman from Massey University. Was it Shane Cronin?
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Shane, he was also doing some research on volcanoes, but he was in Taveuni. I think he was also coming in to investigate the eruption, the timeline. He was trying to put together about Mount Ulunivanua, similar to what you're doing for Mount Washington and Kadavu. So in terms of developing like a timeline, or what you were saying before as a geologist, or a geographer or scientist like yourself, to say that there were eruptions like 3 times over a course of a period of time, how would a geologist or volcanologist, how would you determine it? If you can just share a little bit of the science behind it, Kerao.
Of course. Let me first say, of course, that Shane Cronin is the person who did the research on Nambukulevu. He came and he came and did the dating of the rocks there that I'm quoting. And yes, and he did also work in Taveuni. Yes, I don't know if he's listening, but everywhere I went, I started in Taveuni, and then he came there. Then I went to Kadavu, and then he came there.
You.
So he followed me there. But look, he's a real volcanologist, and I'm not. But so in many cases, you can take the rocks that come out of the volcano, and you can subject them to chemical analysis, and you can find out how many years ago they formed. Now, the problem in Kadavu and in Taveuni is that these places are very wet. So the volcanic rocks change very soon after they've been formed. In dry places, the volcanic rocks can stay for tens of thousands of years and can still be dated using this kind of analysis. But in places like Fiji, they weather, they fall to pieces very quickly. So it's not always easy to put an age on this. So you've got to sometimes look for other things. So sometimes in the volcanic rocks, you can find bits of wood. And if you find bits of wood, then you can use radiocarbon dating, because wood is made from carbon. You can use radiocarbon dating to find out the age of the wood, and therefore the age of the volcanic rocks that it's in. In some cases, and I actually did some research on this in Samoa, when a volcano erupts, sometimes it goes out across the coral reef, and so the volcanic rocks actually take up little bits of coral reef, and you can still get in there and take out the coral, and you can find out using radiocarbon dating how old the coral is. But I think, as the story we discussed at the beginning of this session shows, science can only go so far, and it's really the memories of the people who live in places like Kadavu that is the main source of understanding of these things. I'll give you an example from Australia, where I've got a student working on this, and there's a volcano in the north of Queensland called Kinrara, and we used to think it last erupted about 50,000 years ago. And my student was talking to the local indigenous people there, and they had a whole series of stories about a time when a witch doctor made a pit in the ground and stirred up the sand in there, and gas came out of that pit, and it caused the people to choke and their eyes to sting, and you know, and the rivers all filled with fire. And all this is a memory of a volcanic eruption. And science would never have known about this if it wasn't for the indigenous people's stories about this. So, you know, I think your point is really important, that every part of what it means to be Kei Kadavu is important, not just to who you are, but also to your history. And 100 years from now, you know, we still want to have the names of places preserved, because that is one way, as Paulo said, you know, to understand our history in countries like Fiji. But it's also important to listen to your grandparents' stories, you know, and I don't know, just to sort of say, well, what could this story possibly mean? It was really interesting when we spoke to Ratu Petero in Ono and Ratu Eveli in Nambucalevu Ira. All the kids came in and they sat down quietly at the back and they listened to these gentlemen telling the story. You know, some of the kids had heard the story before, but some of the kids hadn't. And I said to Petero afterwards, I was saying, you know, this is exactly the kind of thing that you must try not to lose, hey? Because once that's lost, then what is there left, you know? Sorry, I don't mean to lecture you. I just, but it's what you're saying as well, hey?
Like I like what you said, that when Ratu Petero and them were talking or sharing the story, the children were allowed to sit in. But on my program, I've always been sharing earlier on the importance of the older generation to be sharing their story to the younger generation. That is to happen maybe 3-4 generations ago. Recently, there's hardly, you know, a lot of that. Maybe there's a few happening in some of the villages. I, you know, stand to be corrected, but maybe we need to encourage more. Yeah, more Veitalanoa. And also when the children come in, don't chase them out. Au sandori dai pedi sono corro, then the na vale songo. Sa tukun server nangon. Hey, dolo ketemu. Iyo, dolo ketemu wasawasa. No, orto sernaya. Those are the future of Nambucalevu, or those are the future of Davingele. Bring them in. Even if you're drinking grog, if the children are sitting, kwa sarangaya. Those children, they will listen and they will carry on those stories and heritage with them until they die. You know, I think that's a really, really good, you know, sharing of our legacy. We can then ito ke sa ker saranga na Veitalanoa. We can to may vanua me was say to Veitalanoa. We can to mingalira Nambucalevu Ira mentavingele lomachi but kita laulia ke tu sona Veitalanoa Macau sona wudu some old chants na meke tumbeka sona sere. I think the Department of Heritage and Culture and the Ministry of Itoke Affairs, they've been doing such a wonderful job in recording a lot of our old chants and our songs and our meke. I think going back to 2006, they've been starting this project called Cultural Mapping Paddy. I'd like to acknowledge Neta Simeone Sevundrende and his team at the Itoke Ministry, that they've been going all over the provinces. I think the last one was the province of Mba. So they've been going to all these provinces and recording all their old stories, na sere, o ira na tuli-tuli, o ira na tali-tali, na kesa-kesa, na sibi-sibi, all those ancient crafts, sa bimbi sarangay, and they've collected it. So that's good. I'm so happy about that. And now with the Kaliopati Tavola and Emma coming in to start writing it and turning it into children's books and writing it in their dialect, so they have set a standard, they've set a template. So now the other villages across Kadavu, and Professor Paddy is an inspiration to many of you. Some of you may be wanting to do geology or volcanology or paleontology and geography. Professor Paddy, can you encourage some of our listeners what should they do if their children are interested to be a volcanologist, for example? I know a lot of children in Vakalevu, they've been looking at that mountain for so many years, and some of them may be thinking, I want to study about this mountain. What should they do, Paddy Kerker?
I think, you know, it's like watching the Olympics, and you talk to the gold medal athletes talk to you afterwards, and they're asked, well, how did you get there? And the answer is always, well, I never gave up. I always believed that I could do it. And I think that's what's at the heart of being a successful geologist or anything else. It is really having the belief in yourself that you can do it. And someone has to be it. Someone has to be the next director of mineral resources for Fiji. You know, these sorts of things are not impossible. But of course, they take self-discipline. They take family support. If there's ever anything that I can do to help someone like that, then you can find out my email fairly easily and just let me know. But Tarisi, could I say one more thing very quickly? And that is, when I was, a lot of my research in Fiji has been, as you know, with the Fiji Museum. And when we were in Kadavu, we had Meli Nanuku, who is their oral historian, oral historical researcher there. Jerry Vesa, who's the videographer, and he videoed both the Ratu Petro and Ratu Eveli interviews very competently, and of course Elia Nakoro, who is director of archaeology there, and all of this was only achievable with the support of Cipriano Nemani. So very grateful to them and everyone else who supported us in Kadavu. And of course, you're absolutely right. You know, I could never have done any research in Kadavu unless people had been prepared to be hospitable to me. And I think, you know, when I look back, it's something that I could never repay back. You know, it's just, people say, of course you can stay with me. You know, if someone rang my doorbell now in the Sunshine Coast and they said, I need to stay somewhere for the night, I'm sorry, you know, go down the road to the Salvation Army. But it's completely different. And you're absolutely right. You know, I'm incredibly grateful to people for their hospitality and their help and, you know, treating me so well. I will never forget that.
Sa Vinaka vakalevu, Professor Patrick Nana, Oklani levutal to nabi korokor mi Kadavu, they will welcome you anytime. And I'm sure they will have the grog ready for you when you come back. And if you know, you have the time to drink grog, they will welcome you back. And we are just so grateful, you know, Professor Paddy, for you to spend this time with us, just to share and share some highlights of the importance of us appreciating our geology of Kadavu Island and learning about Mount Washington. And I have to say and confess that I never knew that, you know, Ono and the islands up north were, you know, part of the volcano activity, and they were like all sunken now. I'm just really pleased to know about that. So if Lenora Gergertambua is listening, please, you need to listen and join me and Paddy for this Talanoa, because this is amazing for Ono. And maybe I was just writing it down too before we finish our Talanoa. Tell us a little bit about Ngaloa. I'm just like amazed, because Ngaloa is right in the middle of you know, the whole island, and is sitting there beautifully. Tell us a little bit about Ngaloa, if possible.
Well, I've never been to Ngaloa, so I can't sound too much of an authority, but it is a volcano by itself. And a lot of the stories about Tatomalau and Tanovu talk about how they fought each other in Nambukilevu. And then they moved along the south coast of Kadavu, and Tanovu was dropping earth, Nangele, from his baskets. and he dropped a whole basket where Ngaloa is. And then they carried on towards Nakasaleka side. And the only geology work that I'm aware of on Ngaloa does suggest that it's a very young volcano compared to the mainland volcanoes there. But I don't want to say anything that's misleading. I'm sure one day one Kei Kadavu will go and study the geology of Ngaloa and let us all know the answer to this.
Yes, and dear Nasara. It's just so, it's making us think now. So for those of you who are from Ngaloa, again, I've got a lot of names that I think the Ngovu family, when we just say Ngovu, and there's a few of you who are listening in. Again, you are opening our eyes now, just to kind of see our islands, with a different lens. So Ngaloa, and I know I'm very familiar with the Vakalevu side because my village is a very tiny village next to Richmond. So I'm on the edge of the district of Yahweh. So Yahweh I think, is a Tikinavo, but our old district used to be Vakalevu. So we used to be part of the Vakalevu district. But this is just really, really, how can I say, very enlightening to many of us, especially from Kadavu, with the work that you have done, with learning about the volcanoes, learning and going all the way to Ono, and again, connecting oral history with your research as well, and then also with the hill forts, with the ulunivanua. So before we conclude our talano today, anything more would you like to share with the ulunivanua that you visited? Was there a name to the ulunivanua? You mentioned, I think you sent it to me on an email.
Yes, they all have names. Yes, of course. They all have names. Gelai Tangane and Korovo were the two that we got radiocarbon ages for. I'll end by telling you the story of the ulunivanua just next to Nambawalu on Ono. So it's between Nambawalu and Vambea. And this is called Mandre. And Mandre, I climbed up there with some of my students and the people from the museum. And we saw, when we were climbing up close to the top, we saw a series of stone walls by Nivatu. Stone walls. And then we went up a bit further and there were all sorts of stone structures. But when we got to the top, it was really interesting because there was the remains of a stone like this. So there were two support stones like this, and there was a big rock that had been laid on top like that. Now it had actually collapsed a bit, but it was clearly there before. And that's really interesting because I know that you have seen the one in Tonga, the trilithon, they call it in Tonga. It's got two big uprights like that, and it's got a flat stone on the top. And in other parts of the world, you find these types of structures, these two stones with a cross stone there. And often these are sites of spiritual significance. And I didn't really get the chance to talk to people in Nambawalu about Mandre, but it seems to me that what you find on the top of Mandre Hill Fort is less of a fortified site. So not so much for defense, but perhaps for some kind of spiritual function. So it had this structure. It also had a peculiar white rock right up on top of the mountain that the local people who came with us, they didn't know what it was. So I would love to go back one day to Mandre and just collect some of the stories about Mandre and have a really good look there, because sometimes I think we think of ulunivanua very two-dimensionally. We think, oh,
Yes.
it was a fortified site. But maybe not all things that we call Koronivalu were associated with conflict. Maybe some of them were associated with spiritual interactions, which is true, as you know, of mountaintops everywhere else in the world. So I think there's a lot more to understand about the early history of Kadavu.
Wow, yes, Vinaka vakalevu for highlighting this for us, and I think that's a really good point to share with our audience. That's a message that we at the Fiji Museum always stress when we go out on our fieldwork is the protection of these heritage sites. Encouraging our people in Kadavu, if they see the Koronivalu or the old village sites, is if they can be left alone or not to be disturbed until they get someone from the Fiji Museum, if possible, if they can come and map it, and look after it, because all those evidence that you have just mentioned about Mandre, has a lot of evidence that maybe is not captured by anyone in the human memory, but it's there archaeologically, or through some of the material culture that you see outside the village. So wow, and it's interesting too, you mentioned that it may be religious spaces or spiritual spaces as well, not necessarily to do with war or conflict. That's a good point. Wow, Vinaka vakalevu sir, Professor Paddy, for highlighting these points for us. And I keep going back to our dear friend Paulo Guerretti, who always remind us, remember to record your old village sites. Even Mandre, it might have a meaning. Yeah, Corvo, we know it has a meaning. And all the other place names that we know in our villages, Venanonda, Vekorokoro, me maroroi na Veitalanoa. Kesaro sarangani volai, na Veitalanoa, me volai vakivola, me wasi sar na Vikor ni Wuli rachumi Kadavu. Saro sarangani da kawanga, we came doon na tungas ni Wuli, bereta, came doon na early childhood. Education, early ECE, mundo sa teka buba wala sarangani Veitalanoa Macau, me volai me wasi ni vera nangwan. Yes, nakavalevu sir, Professor Paddy, for your amazing sharing today. I think Dr. Elise Hafa has a question here. Dr. Elise Hafa from Pacific Harbor, Vinaka Elise, bonjour. I think Professor Paddy, there's a question here to do, I think, with the story from Otanovo and Tautau Molau. Is there any connection back to Ngaloa in Serua or Taunovo in Serua? Anything that is connected that way, Professor Paddy?
Vinaka Elise, good to hear from you. I think not, because the name of the Vu, or the god from Ono, is Ta Novu, not Tau Novu. Yeah, it's Tanovu. So it's a different spelling, and it was made very clear, because as soon as I heard it, I said, "Oh, Tau Novu," and he said, "No, no, 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 no." So, but look, Paula Garrity will tell you also that the dialect they speak in Ono is very close to Serua, so maybe there is a connection. Sorry, I need to cough.
Iya, agora vou manda mutala no manda dia saranga me vakalevu ni vanua, Iya, so Dr. Elise, iya, so it's Tanovu, and the other one in Ngaloa Serua is Taunovo, so Taunovo. This one is Tanovu. Vinaka vakalevu. Well, that clears that question as well. So Vinaka vakalevu, we came in Taro Chukumai. I think I was listening more to Paddy, and I didn't read the questions that were coming through. But maybe after our Talanoa, I can harvest the questions and message them and connect them with you. Will that be okay, Paddy?
Of course. No problem.
We are just so happy, Paddy, that you can take this time away from your busy schedule in the Sunshine Coast to come in Talanoa to our families from Kadavu. So this is just a little taster to there's so much more out there. So what we will do maybe after this Talanoa, I will talk to Paddy and we can go through some of our references of some of our reports or books or anything that some of you want to explore further, and we can share them with you. Yeah, so if any of you are interested in getting maybe some references from me and Professor Paddy, send me a messenger email, talanoa@gmail.com, or just send me a messenger message, and I will definitely put something together and share some links with you all. So before we talanoa me o tinidor talanoa Paddy, do talana kauwe wasia. Maybe some word of encouragement to our listeners, or some thank you messages if you like, or anything you want to say. Vinaka Paddy.
I've really enjoyed all the times that I went to Kadavu, from the drinking the grog with the crew of the ulunivanua to my most recent trip to Ono, where I stayed in Nawaisomo with Petro and Vara. Look, I think you are some of the most hospitable people on earth, and you've treated me with kindness and respect, and in return I would like to give back as much as I can to you of the knowledge that I have of the place where you live. I think you're very fortunate to come from Kadavu. I think it's a beautiful place. The reason it's such a beautiful place is because it's a series of volcanoes all stuck together. And when volcanoes get wet, then they create this really, really fertile soil. So you can grow magnificent crops, as every Kai Kadavu knows, in the soils of Kadavu, far better than you can grow in many other places, including Namosi, if there's anyone from Namosi listening. I think you have a lot to be proud of. I suppose the word of encouragement would be that sometimes the weight of Western knowledge and Western understanding seems so great that you think, I have nothing to compete with this. But actually you do. And I would predict that over the next 10 or 20 years, we are going to see a real increase in interest in indigenous knowledge. Not just knowledge about the natural environment, but also an understanding of how the natural environment operates. I really predict this is going to happen. So this is a good time, like Dr. Teresi says, it's a good time to be conserving your own traditional knowledge, the stories of your grandparents, and so on and so on. Yes, I don't know what else to say really. One thing I was really struck on Ono Island was the way that Tanovu was everywhere in the landscape. It was really interesting because I was going along with Petro one day and he said, over there is the Nduruni Tanovu, the knees of Tanovu. I said, hey? And he said, there, those two mountains, those are Tanovu's knees. And over there, those are his shoulders. And you can see where his arm goes around there. And the whole of Ono Island can be seen not as an ancient volcano, but as a person. And to me, that is an understanding of the landscape that is just as valid as a scientific one. So all these kinds of things, I think, are really important to understand, and not to feel that you can't talk about them, or that you're mandua because you're embarrassed because you think that people will laugh at you, or things like that. So be proud of who you are and what you know.
So, wow, that is a wonderful way to end our Talanoa. I think a lot of my friends listening in, they just want this Talanoa to continue for the next 2 hours.
Dotala na singa.
Doon talaga siya. Yes, wrong Vinaka Gina, because Professor Paddy has to go and have his dinner, and I will have to go and have my grog. Yes, that is a beautiful way to end our Talanoa, that we of Kadavu, we have so much to be proud of. So our children who are listening in, be proud. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, Vinaka when if you have the opportunity to share your story, kuni mandua, tu dake, talano takano mi talano, meron ka nakasa to my Professor Paddy. Sometimes we, when we have indigenous knowledge on this side, and then you have science, ever kind of don't better to, you kind of like, oh, go on go talano Macau, and you keep looking down on it. And then when it's science, or when it's volcanology, or paleontology or archaeology, everybody, oh, come back Sarangango. But sometimes now with the study with the Talano with Paddy, there's a little bit of that balance that we need to approach the indigenous knowledge and the Western science. Because as the example that Professor Paddy shared in Australia, the science was informed by the indigenous knowledge Talanoa, right? With the river of fire, right? And that story that came from indigenous communities. So there you go. And even by looking at Ono, Tanovu is everywhere. The knees is over there. The arms are there. The head is over there. Yes, and that is so beautiful. So all around Ono, the story of Tanovu is there. It's right there in front of you. You just have to open your eyes to see what's there. Yes, totoka bakauchi. So on that note, Nakavalev Sarah Paddy, and I look forward to invite you again for another Talanoa. And there's a couple more provinces down in the next couple of months. I will knock on your door when another opportunity for you to come comes across my table. Will that be okay?
Vinaka, of course it'll be okay.
Tandon. Vinaka Sarah Paddy, and aloha to the family, to Rosaline and Petra. Madamanda. Isa, Vinaka. Vinaka Isa. To all of you who are listening in, Vinaka vakalevu for joining me and Professor Patrick Nunn. He's logging in from the Sunshine Coast in Australia. It's been a wonderful, wow, I'm looking at the time, an hour and a half. Wow. I promised Paddy 1 hour, and it's definitely Kadavu time. So my apologies, Professor Paddy, we took another half an hour from your time. So Vinaka to all our listeners who are listening in. Wow, we came to this Talanoa excited about learning the geology of Kadavu, learning about Ulunivanua, learning about Ono, and even today there was a bonus, the island of Ngaloa. So to our Ngaloa cousins and all my aunties and uncles in Ngaloa, there's a lot of research to be done on a beautiful island. And I'm sure when the Fiji Museum, comes together with support from our international museum friends and other archaeologists, we will be returning to Kadavu when the border opens. And I'm sure the hospitality that was extended to Professor Paddy will be extended to us as well when we come to the island. Nakavalev sarvi kemi na vararongo mai, nitaka ni rongo binakchuka na Veitalanoa bat ki Professor Paddy, and nakavina ni kua, kito salalom sar chuka ni vakalevu kemi to doko, and then gami sotel chuka na kavini matake. Baka chuka sona taro, membaleta na talo ni kua, message may be out. Au nangai semata na nomuni taro ve Professor Paddy. Ia kebaka sobi kemni sabi bitar directly to him. You can Google his name and you can easily find him. He also have a website. So if you go straight to his website, you can send him a message and he will be there to answer your question. Okay, Vinaka Valev Sara, Vinaka Professor Paddy, Vinaka Valev to all our listeners. Goodbye and ahui ho from Hawaii. Wadamanda.
Mode, stay safe.
Mode Paddy.
Mode Tarisa.
Nakavalevu. Isa. Sa ato toko makawati na Veitalanoa na sino Vinaka ni kuando marau nila kumai o Professor Patrick Nunn may wase levo sar naka beleto na yan no Kadavu. O kilavi kenda na turanga marama ni Kadavu na dorobo na ngone leo ke kem ni nangone. May bakasa tukun chika Paddy, you have to be proud to come from Kadavu. Na levo ni Talanoa tu geological history, archaeology, geology, paleontology, volcanology. There's so much science and information that we can learn about our island. Nando to yan mi Kadavu. Sa rota me ngun Vinaka, som Vinaka na agora ni Kadavu, balete ni bulong-bulong chiko na nondungele. Ngele talaga ni ulunivanua kama, na volcano. Ni ngendo kada mbate Vinaka na volcano, ngendo la kumay na kena rabusa, na kena rabusa mir sangay may tuin ng delingele sangay korotun donan raw nembak ronan raw nembak da sangay bitang-tangay may na nanggele sangay taw may nalang sangay durumo tuwan ni ka sangay bulang-bulang binagatu na rabusa ni volcano kormir sangay may taw tunan ng vanua da sangay la kumay nanundungase da sangay rakami titi araw to may bulang-bulang na suli ng bulan-bulan na Angola, bulan-bulan na Tapioca, na uvi, balete ni bulan-bulan na nandoto yan. O sa babi ni Vinaksarbi ke muto doko, na nungguweka, musema chumelevu, umaru tekina ni mutali tekina na Veitalanoa, wat ki Professor Patrick Nunn, o kla ni levu tali tu ni Talanoa si chiku wame na kayo siya, e vinakataloke me lista lemay. Kaya baka na lista mo kaya na korokor ni Madaw ni Okusita, o lusuris ke talme mido Talanoa ni Talanoa, balete ni tungangan sinang vakalevu, Ormer dungangan jiono, ngai wase talanga mi keso ni Talanoa ni sono kormakao, ba usibi talanga ni sama ituru na Veitalanoa na yavutu totok o ngaloa. Sama chuk talanga na Veitalanoa meri, unita kina ni na tos chungana na do vakadidike, tos chungana na do wili vola, wane sobi ke mu Vinaka me ngai vakayavutaki so na ivola so mumba wilika. Cukup talanga biau so na ivola makao ni vakadidike, cukup talanga be Professor Paddy, or mere na ngai vakayavutaki wike mu, ke baka mu Vinaka me mu le wilika talatunga, le usar nere Vinaka. Menda vulira bata. O saba bini Vinaka na musema cukup mayo sana vamo dia tu wike mu to toksar. Kuila rawanga, loma Vinaka vakalevu, puno wecha sesturanga va, Vinaka vakalevu sarbuni wai na sema cukup mai bil tuketei, iliani tukena tambua, isa. Vinaka vakalevu sar anisa wase, iya Vinaka vakalevu sar na rabutu cukup nunggu ili ni kor iyo, nunggu kor mena tokalau, ni cikino yawe. Gabi Vinaka uvasu I nuku na cikino tabuki. Iya Vinaka vakalevu sar nuku bumbunga, bumbu terisi marama ni wailevu terisi musin wailala. Iya Vinaka vakalevu sar sabamo cuka nuku tutu nuku tutu mai nuku tutu pita susu batu. Vinaka vakalevu sar. O sabamo cuka tu vike muto dok sar na sema cuka meni levu ndagai sema meni mataka na nando buleng cuka ni mataka o Professor Stephen Ratuba. Na turang ni nayochi na tikina o yale. O ni tikina ni muna sema mai na wolo kalau ni mataka na nonggo bata-batalangan ni Talanoa Dr. T na may ndo tal cunga ni rumah Talanoa baka biokan na turangan ni nayochi ka sa alo musol sarchukia ndo na erno na marau ni surai stal cunga kia melakamai may Talanoa. Kaya baka cuka talanga sono muweka mu ngandreba me lakamai may Talanoa nonggo bata-bata mungay message nga may biaw na nonggo messenger au nangai jigita kinen dona chikin singa menangai ndoya to non Talanoa peke muna weka mu Vinaka mu lakumai mu mi biwo sei na nande bata-bata ni vuli kena bata-bata ni veiyanuyanu kena bata-bata ni vakayavutaki au sava mat suka to kaya Hawaii mu moade takamanda.